Thank you for being here for today's JCI Forum, held in conjunction with the launch of the book Malaysian Politics in the New Media Age, Implications on the Political Communication Process by Dr. Pauline Leong. This book provides a comprehensive overview of the impact of the internet on Malaysian politics and how it has played a pivotal role in influencing the country's political climate. Without further ado, may I invite to the front our panelists for the day, the book author herself, Dr. Pauline Leong from the Department of Communication, Shannon Teoh, Malaysia Bureau Chief of the Straits Times, and our moderator for the day, Professor Bradley Freeman, Head of the Department of Communications at Sunway University. Unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, Jahabah Sadiq will be replaced by Professor James Chen, Senior Fellow at JCI. Professor Freeman, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you all for coming and being a part of this event. My name is Bradley, and I am the HOD Department of Communication, School of Arts here at Sunway University. It's my pleasure to introduce our panelists this afternoon. Shannon Teoh cut his teeth in print, web, and wire agency journalism before joining the Straits Times in 2014 after a decade of covering everything from pop culture to politics, money to motoring. He took a one-year break from Malaysia News in 2009 after winning the Chevening Scholarship to complete his postgraduate studies at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, focusing on political communication. After returning to Malaysia, he spent 2 years as an assistant news editor at the Malaysian Insider before moving on to become a local correspondent for AFP in 2012. And our new addition to the panel is Professor James Chen. He is a senior fellow and the director of governance studies at the Jeffrey Cheah Institute on Southeast Asia at Sunway University. He is also the inaugural director of the Asia Institute, University of Tasmania. He is, of course, a leading commentator on Malaysian politics and has published extensively on Malaysia and the surrounding region. He was previously Senior Visiting Research Fellow, Institute of Southeast Asian Studies in Singapore and Professor of Political Science, Monash University's Malaysia campus. And it also gives me pleasure to introduce Dr. Pauline Leong, who's currently a senior lecturer in the Department of Communication. She completed her PhD with Monash University, Malaysia, specializing in the area of political communication. She also has a Master's of Mass Communication from Nanyang Technological University and an LLB honors from the National University of Singapore. Dr. Pauline was also a former journalist with the Singapore Straits Times, and her research interests include new media and politics, as well as freedom of speech. And it is her new book that brings us together today. So the way that we're going to run things this afternoon is I have a few questions that I've prepared for our panelists. And so we'll have them answer the questions to the best of their abilities. And we'll leave time at towards the latter half of the session to take questions, comments from the audience as well in a Q&A forum. Okay? So thanks again for being here. I suppose the first question is the most obvious one, and it comes from our recognition of the times we live in and the peculiarities of social media in particular. So the first question is, how important is the use of social media for politicians in Malaysia? And why don't we start off with Dr. Pauline, and then we can come back down this way.
Hi. Good afternoon, everyone. I think that for politicians, social media is essential because if you're at a national level, it can help you to actually reach out to the masses without necessarily having gatekeeping by the media. You can actually, connect with the voters directly. And it's very useful because you can actually, change your image. For example, Tun Dr. Mahathir in the last elections, he successfully used Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, to turn his image from that of a strong man into someone who is like a grandfather who is trying to save the country and, and rectify himself and redeem himself from his past mistakes. So it is essential, as part of the arsenal of strategies. For newer politicians, I feel that it is also a useful tool, especially if no one knows very much about them. If they're a newbie in the political scene, they are able to have brand name recognition. They can interact directly, and if let's say the media doesn't have time or space to cover them, it doesn't matter because they have this other arsenal, this other tool which they can use to connect with the voters. And especially with, with Undi 18 coming up, the next general elections, social media will become increasingly important because they are trying to reach out to the youths, and the youths are the ones that are social media savvy. So it is something that they need to take into account in order to, connect with the new voters that are coming in the next elections.
I can't disagree. I mean, even as a reporter, you're often referring to social media, trying to see what the politicians are saying there. It's the most direct way for you to cover a wide swath of newsmakers because, well, media is going through a bit of a downturn right now. There's a lot less money in it. Work that used to be done by 3 reporters are now being done by 1. So you have to be like an octopus, your tentacles everywhere. Coming from a journalist perspective, politicians who don't have a strong social media presence tend to get left out, tend to get left behind. So whether or not we think of mainstream media as important as social media, or less important, more important, social media is also a tool that informs mainstream media, and there's a bit of a feedback that goes around. So if you were a politician, you have to get into that loop, right? And one of the easiest way to get in is through social media.
Of course, what Pauline and Shannon have said is something that's well known, but I think increasingly as we move towards the next general election, I think social media is both a benefit and also is becoming a very dangerous tool. I think the reality is that increasingly there are organized groups out there who are going to use social media to manipulate the electoral system, especially in terms of fake news. But the clear trend in Malaysia is that I can see a situation where, as we head towards the next election, politicians will actually subcontract the work out in terms of social media to professional providers of the dark services. And this is something I saw happening very clearly in Indonesia and Thailand, and I think this is a new phenomenon. So basically, for me, right, while social media helps the unknown politician to gain a limelight, what we're seeing is a professionalization or the provision of dark services that's will be coming through over the next general election. And I think that's something that the public needs to be aware of. And I think it's something that we will have to learn to live with. And this is just part of the development of social media age in Malaysia.
Dr. Pauline, in your book, you raise the concept of the public sphere. And for those who are unfamiliar with that particular concept, it arises or is linked with the German researcher Jürgen Habermas. And Habermas posits that in order for a society to progress, there has to be the ability for rational discussion. And he thought the ingredients were primarily newspapers, coffee shops and newspapers. Is it possible that social media is replacing the newspaper in a way and the coffee shops altogether and becoming in and of its own right this form, this concept of the public sphere? And how is that impact affecting the politicians and the political process here in Malaysia?
Definitely, the public sphere in Malaysia is mainly online, especially on Twitter. In fact, Malaysians call they call it Twitter Jaya. right? And that's where you get a lot of, the discussion, the coffee shop discussion. And in fact, the coffee shop, the online discussion often spills over to when they actually meet up in coffee shops. So they would show what and WhatsApp also, it's not just Twitter, but WhatsApp. So they will always discuss what they received, on WhatsApp, and they would discuss it. So a lot of this discussion is among the youths in the early days of the internet, where it was they could get. They were online, and they were very media savvy. But in the last elections in G14, because of the cost of mobile phones that was reduced, as well as the WhatsApp, it was easy to use. So you had a lot of the older generation, the grandfathers, your grandmothers, uncles and aunties who also participated. So instead of being a very unique and elitist sort of youth-centered in the previous G13, it became a very much of everyone was participating, everyone was talking. And that would have actually an impact on the problem of fake news, because people were forwarding things without checking. Right? They just say, I just want to share because I felt that it was important for you to know, whether, without actually, figuring out whether it was actually real or not. So that was the main problem, and that would give rise to propaganda. People inadvertently spread propaganda rather than actual news, and that would actually affect what is known as the public sphere. Because in Habermas's theory, the public sphere is a place where the truth will emerge from the contestation of ideas. But here, they are not ideas, they are propaganda, and it's people are easily influenced by emotions, by memes, etc. So in terms of actually getting the truth out there, it becomes even more murky. Yeah, that's my opinion of that.
I think the distinction between WhatsApp and social media, which is broadcast, right, and it's free for everyone to look at, it's an important distinction, because if I send James a WhatsApp, I don't expect anyone else to see it.
Are you sure?
And I don't expect. So there's a level of there's a personal relationship. And while you may not believe something, especially politicians, who believes politicians, right? If a politician puts something out on his Twitter account, on his Facebook account, you might greet that with a bit of cynicism, with a bit of, I'm not sure if this is the truth. But if your friend, your relative sends you something on WhatsApp, you tend to want to believe it must be true because you care about me and you're sending this to me so that I'm informed of this. And if you actually go and look at how the digitization of our politics, as it were, kind of ramped up from 2008, the 12th January election, and a lot of people were reading blogs and things like that. People went away from the mainstream media. And in 2013, in the 13th January election, people started talking about social media election. And the last year's election really became a WhatsApp general election. A lot of stuff was going on WhatsApp, which if you were trying to observe it as a media practitioner, you can't, because it's a closed wall, right? I'm not in every WhatsApp group in the country. I'm not in your family's WhatsApp group, in your office's WhatsApp group. So it's very difficult to track what is the sentiment, what people are talking about, and it gives us very surprising results. Analysts and pundits have gotten a lot of recent elections wrong. Not the guys on this panel, they always get it right. But people didn't expect Brexit. People didn't expect Trump to win. People didn't expect Pakatan Harapan to win last year. So when you come back to this idea of the public sphere, I think what Habermas conceived was a very static idea of the public sphere. But when you bring in layers of technology, beyond newspapers, then you had radio, and you have TV, and now we're going into stuff that goes on in the internet, and all the different ways that you can use the internet to communicate. You kind of you break the idea of the public sphere at the seams, right? It's no longer a circle you draw around, and you know what's in it and what's outside, right? Things that are in the private sphere spills over into the public sphere. Things that are in the public sphere spills over into the private sphere. You would consider your WhatsApp conversation in the private sphere, but, well, not really. I mean, I thought it probably had the biggest impact on our elections of all the other ways that you can use your smartphones and tablets.
Thank you. I think my perspective on the public sphere in Malaysia is slightly different from my two colleagues here. I think what has happened in the Malaysian public sphere with social media is that now a lot of people are sort of split into very clear groups. Some people call it echo chamber. So what you find in Malaysia is that in terms of the public sphere, right, the sort of Bansa crowd, they'll go into a certain type of public sphere. The conservative Muslim, they'll go into their own private WhatsApp group and certain Facebook pages. So there's really no such thing as a single public sphere in Malaysia nowadays. Previously, it was dictated by the vernacular newspapers, English, Malay, and Indian newspapers. But now, basically, is that everybody create their own little public sphere. My colleagues are absolutely right. They start connecting their friends. First, mostly it's done through Facebook. They ask you to join a private group. Then from there, it's turned into a WhatsApp group because they want to send more private materials. The problem with the political side of this WhatsApp group is that very often, because I'm a member of many of these groups, eating out too much of my data, but luckily in Malaysia, WhatsApp data is usually free. What you find is that there are very few groups in Malaysia that is purely political. People always send jokes around, and the other thing that they love to send around in Malaysia, I don't know why, is that they love to send over health tips. You know, you eat this, you'll be better. This is a herbal potion to solve all your kidney problem, all this stuff. And they mix it out with politics, which I find surprisingly interesting because I'm in certain WhatsApp group in other countries, and they don't seem to mix this up. But in Malaysia, we just love to mix everything, including celebrating you. So these are some of the unique things. So basically the point I'm making is that, yes, there is such a thing as a public sphere, but in Malaysia it's segmented by different groups, ethnic groups, religious groups, different interests, and it is not purely based on one item. People tend to mix and match within these public spheres.
I think that for me, the WhatsApp, right, it's not necessarily that private because, like James mentioned, I'm also a member of several groups, and some of these are like, groups that have 100 old people, or 200 old people, and these to me function as a sort of like a public sphere because some of them, the people that are in that groups, I don't know them, so we get materials sent by these strangers and all that, and that would form a small little public sphere to discuss certain things, right? But it's not necessarily that private because I won't know who they are, right? So we could have small groups of different public spheres, and it's like Shannon said, it's very hard to trace, which brings me to my point that we need to also, as politicians, right, we can't just rely on the online hype. I was doing my fieldwork in the 13 January elections, and I saw the hype on Facebook. It's like everybody was saying that, yes, Pakistan is going to win, Pakistan is going to win. And the thing is that when I went down on the ground on the rallies, I listened to the crowd that was at the rallies, and I came to a conclusion that Pakistan is unlikely to win. But I kept my, I was just a PhD student, so I just kept my feelings, my analysis to myself, and of course I wrote it in my thesis, but the ground did not understand what the politicians were talking about. Things were like the Scorpion scandal, etc. The ground people were not aware. Because the internet penetration was not as strong as G14. So the politicians themselves at the rallies had to explain the issues that were circulating online, that were hyped up online, but the ground was not aware. But the atmosphere was different in the 14 general elections. When you went on the ground, when you mentioned the word chin, the ring, then everybody was like, whoa, laughing away, and there was like, they didn't have to explain that much. They, people had basic understanding because they were already receiving these materials from either Facebook or Twitter or WhatsApp. So they had a basic understanding. And so therefore the mood changed in the general GE14, because they already had that understanding thanks to social media.
Now, Dr. Pauline, also in your book, you mention this idea that originally the internet and the social media, the government was excited about this because they viewed this as a potential area for commercial growth, that it could help in marketing and other areas, tourism and like as such. But perhaps they were not thinking so much about the interconnectivities that could be made among citizens. Could you address that issue of this gap between seeing the commercial potential and this idea that they needed to embrace new technologies to be modern, but then kind of having a blind spot about how it would affect the political landscape?
I think the internet itself is a double-edged sword. I think most governments during that time in Asia felt that it was a way forward. They could see the economic benefits when they saw it in other countries that were more developed, like the US and UK. So they felt that if we do not embrace this technology, we will be left out. And it can be very clearly seen that right now we are reaping the benefits. We have got e-commerce, e-technology. We cannot be left out. We have to introduce this, we have to bring this technology in. But of course, with every technology, this idea of that whether technology will change society, social determinism versus technological determinism. So with bringing the technology in, people would use it, and people would use it in ways which you did not anticipate. Right, and I think that's what happened. That they did expect people to use it for commerce, but people did use it for other ways, perhaps to communicate, to have different ideas, and that's part of having technology that would be liberating, and also it was a way to overcome the barriers of the media, the traditional media, which was a lot of gatekeeping, which was with the government controlling on. So the internet was like a breath of fresh air when it came in. People could use it without worrying very much, about it being controlled. Yeah. So that was the unintended aspect of the technology that came in.
I mean, the internet's been around. Coming up 30 years. How long has it been around? And back then, when it first arrived in Malaysia and you're using your dial-ups, the only thing the only place you could go to get something which wasn't in the mainstream media was Malaysia Kini, right? We had one alternative news portal. And by the time 2008 rolled around, you had all these blogs and so on and so forth. Now, and you can see how the game, in terms of digitization of politics, has changed a lot with technology. We did a story before the last general election where we mapped the maps of 3G and 4G coverage across the country from the state it was in 2013 and how it was at the end of 2017. We didn't have 2018 at that point. And you could see where the 4G coverages had enlarged and where the 3G coverages had enlarged. And the interesting thing was a lot of it had happened in areas like Johor and Pahang, in the more rural areas, which happened to also be the Felda areas. And a lot of these seats did flip over at the last general election. So yes, there is a sense that you need the technology to basically for economic advancement, right? But at the end, it's difficult to govern what people are going to do with the internet, right? And the moment it hit the rural areas, of course, they will last, because if you want to roll out CAPEX, it's always better to do it in the urban areas until you get a sizable market in the rural areas. I don't know how it's going to play out, for example, by the next election, where there are many rural areas in places like Sabah, Sarawak, which are still not served with the internet, where the only internet you can get is if you go to the nearest school and stand under the tower that's in the school and try to get some 3G data. So political change that's being caused by internet penetration, that story isn't done yet. There's still places that are not penetrated. And of course, how you use social media, it used to be Facebook, Twitter, now everyone's on Instagram, things like TikTok and Snapchat, which I have no idea how to use anyway. So that game is also going to change, right? And how a politician engages in those media. To have a team just going on Facebook and posting out an update is one thing. To do your own Snapchat is a different game. So you can see how some politicians are better at it. Some politicians have better teams doing their social media. And hey, it's going to be big business as well. Maybe I should get into it.
Shannon, hold on to the mic for a moment, if you would, please, because I'd like to get your perspective on the idea, the notion that the mainstream traditional media, do they understand social media? I mean, in doing research a year or two ago in Vietnam, what my co-author and I found was that the media outlets were unaware of policies that the government wished to or wanted to put forth based on the new media. So are we still in a fluidic space here? We're still in an area where we're trying to figure this out. And how is that in Malaysia? Does the government issue policies? Are the outlets aware of them? And what's happening there?
Well, I think as far as the government is concerned, and let's not talk about political parties, but government, right? We're talking about the ministries, the agencies, so on and so forth. They all still send out anything new to the mainstream media, to reporters, to editors, so on and so forth. That still happens. That's still the first channel by which things go out. Most of them would have social media channels, which they will blast out as well. And the public can pick it up directly from there. But that's always going to be largely things like graphics, right? So if you launch a policy on fuel subsidies, for example, you're going to get this graphic coming out, right? From 1st of January, RAW 95 is going to be this price. And it's not really explaining why the policy is in place. That bit still goes through mainstream media for right now. So if you're asking if the public is going to understand policy just via social media, probably not, or maybe not yet. It might happen moving forward.
James, may I please ask you, I'm going to make reference to two pop culture items here globally, I hope everyone will get, but I'm a big fan of The Orville, which is a sort of a science fiction show, and also Black Mirror, which is a Netflix show. And in each of those series, there is a particular episode wherein we see that the society's become so enamored with social media that people are given ratings, so to speak. And certain items that get into the network and social media become more important than others. Are we looking at a Malaysia where politicians are going to cater to the most number of hits, the most number of clicks, what is happening on social media? Should politicians be paying a lot of attention to these public reactions and to these memes that they're seeing? Or are they giving them too much, maybe more attention than they should?
My impression of Malaysia is that when you talk about social media and its reach, you really have to divide the country into three separate areas, and they sort of don't overlap. One is the urban area, one is the rural area, and the third area is Sabah and Sarawak. I'm not aware of the two shows that you mentioned. I'm not sure the politicians in this country keep track of the social media outreach, who reads them, how many hits they have. But I do know that the people around them take them quite seriously. I'd just like to come back to what Shannon was saying about social media used by government. I think the government machinery itself actually are very bad users of social media. The so-called government people using social media are actually the press set. These are actually not government employees. They work on contract for the ministers. The sort of official stuff that come out of government social media is usually the picture of the minister, the deputy minister cutting a ribbon, visiting schools. For the individual YBs, it's probably looking at the longkang or the drain, that sort of stuff. But in terms of actual story, they don't do any stories. The most they'll provide is 1 or 2 paragraphs about why the minister was there. So I think the use of social media in the government is still at a very, very low level. And in fact, if you speak to the current government now, they keep complaining that the good news about the Pakatan Harapan is actually not getting out because the government communication people are actually so bad at what they're doing. And after a while, they actually complain it's the deep state. But I actually think it's incompetence, but that's another story. But I think, so when you talk about social media use in Malaysia, so you basically talk about 3 very distinct groups, the urban group, rural group, Sabah and Sarawak. Coming back to Sabah and Sarawak, I just want to add one very important point. Social media reach in Sabah and Sarawak is getting deeper. One of the really interesting things is that even if you visit the rural longhouse where there's no Wi-Fi signals, it's interesting that all the people holding smartphones in the longhouse, they actually have a WhatsApp account, despite the fact that they don't have Wi-Fi. So they use it extensively in when they go to urban area where there's a Wi-Fi signal. And the reason for that is actually quite simple. Many of these rural people actually work in Peninsular Malaysia. The good thing about WhatsApp is that they can send small, what they call audio recordings and videos. So you can actually receive it anytime. So it's just like mail. When you go to the local area, you download the thing. So social media is actually has a wider reach than most people think. It's just that they don't get it immediately. They get it when there's a hotspot. So you shouldn't really write off Sabah and Sarawak. It's just a different way of delivery. But other than that, I think the pickup rate is very high. I just want to tell you guys my own personal experience. Many years ago, when this thing started taking off, in Malaysia, in the rural areas, people got very excited. Remember, there used to be a time in Malaysia when you go to every rural town, there used to be a cyber cafe. You pay your $2 to use it. And being somebody interested in politics, I thought, wow, all these people are reading newspaper, read line. In fact, they're not. They're all visiting pornographic sites. So, so when we talk about the use of internet, I always have to remind the audience, the people who are actually interested in politics in Malaysia is like less than 10%. The other 90% of the people in this country are more interested in what is the latest Samsung mobile phone, whether there's a rebate on DG or that sort of stuff. So we shouldn't be too obsessed with politics. Of course, it is important politicians are using social media. The really important thing about social media in this country is that they shape the debate. And the reason why they shape the debate is because they use on both sides to draw attention from far more serious issues. So there are lots of people here who spend all the time today, right? How do I create controversy? I mean, you all know about certain websites here. What they do is, the perfect example of somebody who creates controversy on a 24-hour basis is RPK's Malaysia Today. People say it's a news site, but he doesn't actually produce any news. Right? He takes news from all over the place. He put it out and try to pretend to be a news website. But actually what he does is the short videos, short commentary pieces that draws a controversy and distract everyone else from the real issues in this country. So in some ways, Malaysia is an interesting experiment because we have different ethnic groups here promoting different public spheres, and they're doing stuff which I think in some ways are actually quite different from the rest of Southeast Asia.
One of the things that we might hope on, WhatsApp groups is that there might be someone who is knowledgeable in a particular area, such that when something comes across, they could, comment on it. Although, in my own experience and in my WhatsApp community groups, there are some things that will come across, and I know them to be inaccurate, but I don't say it because I don't see it as my place in my community WhatsApp group to, make that correction. And this is something I think that the traditional media do well. They have the gatekeepers and the editors. But the proliferation of fake news and propaganda on social media is occurring. So, Dr. Pauline, in Malaysia, what are your concerns about that? Fake news.
Fake news obviously has been around for some time, but the impact has worsened because of social media. The speed you can actually forward to many people, and it spreads very fast. So hence the impact of fake news has actually been quite quite bad. Yeah, I think that when it comes to fake news, right, I think media literacy is a very important thing that we need to have. Before you forward, please check. And also gatekeeping, especially for administrators of WhatsApp group. From my personal experience in my community, I do check and I do fact check, and it takes up extra time, but I feel that it's part of my community, part of my social service in order to make sure that fake news doesn't get spread. Of course, it's not an easy task because people are often upset if you check on them. Right? Yeah, they check on them and they say, you're like, especially if they're older than you, and they get upset that you have, said that what they have sent is wrong. But I feel that it's important, not just for myself, but for everyone who is actually a social media user. It is our responsibility to make sure that whatever we send is not something that would make people confused, and in fact, we may be inadvertently sending out propaganda instead and making the situation even more confusing instead of the truth.
What's that saying? evil triumphs when good men stay silent, right?
And also that a lie travels around the world in the same time period that truth is getting its shoes on.
Shoes on, yeah. So I mean, I have done the same, especially with family WhatsApp groups, where people of my parents' generation, now derogatorily referred to as boomers, would send out stuff, and I would say, no, this is not true, blah blah blah, and I even give them references online. This has been disproved, so on and so forth. But that gave me a reputation as a know-it-all. You become an object of hate for calling people out on lies, apparently. But I just want to share a story about this whole idea of fake news. In July, Parliament, as in Malaysia's Parliament, organized a roundtable on freedom of expression, and I somehow got invited. I'm not sure why. And right at the start, there was a presentation by a journalist, and this journalist was from Bernama, our national news agency, right? In the words of one of the organizers, referred back to a presentation and said that she dropped a real bombshell by revealing that Malaysians use social media for 14 hours a day. Now, I don't know about anyone else in that room, but immediately when I heard that statistic, I said, this can't be right. But it was swallowed whole by an MP. It's a real bombshell. So I went to check it out. It turns out that this was fake news, right? She was referring to a survey done by Ernst & Young in 2016 that said Malaysians spend 13.7 hours on digital devices. Nowhere did it say that it was on social media. Nowhere did it say that it was all while surfing the internet even. So you do a lot of things on your phones, right? One of these things that we used to do was make phone calls. Some people still do that with their phones, apparently. You check other surveys and things like that. If you look at the EY survey, only 4.2 hours of that so-called 14 hours were on a phone. When they said digital devices, they even meant your TV. So watching TV counted in that 14 hours. They even count things like playing video games, reading stuff on your Kindle and things like that. This year we had a YouGov. YouGov is one of these survey organizations, right? And they put Malaysia's average social media usage at under 6 hours. In January, there was another survey, put it at 3 hours. So no one's really sure, but it's not 14 hours. That wasn't even what the survey reported, but it was regurgitated. Because sometimes it's not your intention to put out fake news, but Pauline mentioned media literacy. Oftentimes you can read something and understand something completely different from what you've read. And sometimes because you want that to be the truth. You don't want another truth, you want the truth. And that was the point about echo chambers being made earlier. I just want to share one interesting thing about this. Our own government, MCMC, they ran a survey of internet usage, and they found the average usage is 6.6 hours, average internet use per person, which to me is quite phenomenal. That's still a lot, but that's how much the internet has taken over our lives. The interesting thing is that the highest usage group are those in their 20s, 8 hours a day. Then the figure drops off all the way until the oldest group of people in their 60s, which is 3.7 hours. I just want to match this with two other surveys, two other studies that were done. And they found that those aged 65 and above share fake news 7 times as often as those in their 30s. Okay? And only 1% of individuals account for 80% of fake news going around. Okay? And what I'm trying to say is, you get a lot of boomers telling kids, why you spend so much time on the internet? Right? Why are you wasting your time? So on and so forth. You know what kids are doing on the internet? They're finding the truth. Right? I would say old people are not on the internet enough, and that's why they're spreading a lot of fake news. They spend 3.7 hours on the internet instead of 8 hours as kids do, but they send 7 times as much fake news as kids do. So I still believe the internet is a tool for good, despite all this concern about proliferation of fake news. The problem is people don't use the internet enough. There's a lot of information out there, and you can check your information and verify it across different sources to find out if it's true. Maybe it's easy for me to say because I'm a journalist and that's my day job, right? Maybe other people don't do it, but that's what we should be encouraging people to do. Use the internet more.
I do agree with Shannon's point, but perhaps it's not so much about the time, but also the tools. You know, like for example, I had to share with someone, you can just use Google and just Google that particular phrase, which finds that is a bit off, and then you actually find out whether it's true or not. So it's not just about the time, but also equipping them with the tools and also with the skepticism. Because when you read something and you know that it sounds a bit off, then perhaps you could check on it. And, you know, Google's the most useful things to do that, you know, to check on it. And I think that Google is starting with this Google News initiative, which they are trying to also help to assist. So media literacy for me would be like equipping people with the skills. You know, what tools to use, how do you check, how do you fact check? Of course, it cannot be 100%. It's not possible to fact check everything. Like, you know, the case that you mentioned, it's a bit difficult. You have to do a lot of tracing, you know, and who has got time to do that? But I think the basic checks can be done if people just take an extra maybe 2-3 minutes, 5 minutes just to verify before they send. I think that would be really, and if everybody does that, right, it really makes the public sphere a much easier place to navigate.
And there are a number of agencies worldwide, and non-government for the most part, that are sprouting up in an attempt to provide that gatekeeping function in a way. I mean, most of us are familiar with Snopes, where we can go to check out the veracity of a rumor that we've heard. Did Jackie Chan have a heart attack? You know. And so there are others. I was in the Philippines last week. They had Stop the Spread, which was a new app that they have where you can check a headline against reality. So what do you think we can do? This is, I guess, one of my last questions, and then I want to open it up to the floor. What is being done? What can we do to stop the spread of fake news, to address the issue of fake news? And how is that potentially going to affect the next elections that are coming up? Are we ready for the future of social media in Malaysia and politics?
For me, right, I think that media literacy should be at least a subject or a module in the schools. In fact, I was just searching in the Philippines. They actually started, introducing this, as part of the school syllabus. So we can start from young, and from the young we can educate, their parents. So that we need to start somewhere. But right now we don't have anything of that sort. It is what we learn from, on the ground, trial and error, that kind of thing, and we learn along the way. So I think a formalized curriculum, at least, would help address these fake news. And if you think that for next elections, I think that it might get worse, in terms of fake news, as what James mentioned, it's being outsourced. And you have the professionals doing it. So how are we, as the average, voter, able to see through all the propaganda that is being put out, and it could be very, you wouldn't be able to spot it because it'll be very sophisticated. We are getting, in fact, I would say that we're getting more and more sophisticated in terms of messaging. In terms, and you get professionals doing it who do it for a living, so it's very hard, and that's where we need to be really, really alert and be aware that and be skeptical. Basically, don't take everything at face value. I think one of the things about the older generation, like what Shannon mentioned, is because in the past, the older generation, they had gatekeepers. They were used to trusting the media because it's already being vetted through by the traditional media, so they for them it's they easily trust what is online. But for us we are digital adopters, and perhaps like you say, it's a job hazard, and so I'm more skeptical than the rest of maybe some of the other peers, but I hope that people would be skeptical and don't believe everything that they receive.
So post-truth, right? I mean, whatever you want to call it. People are finding that if perception matters more than fact. And I can tell you that this is actually one of the conversations going around in government stratcoms, that when Guan Eng, the finance minister, announces something, what happens is that there is a section of the Malay ground which goes, Guan Eng is cutting our allocation again, right? And they get angry and they say DAP is anti-Malay and things like that. But if Mahathir was to make, the Prime Minister was to make the same announcement, the reaction would be, oh, thank God Mahathir managed to get us some allocation, right? It can be the same figure. So who is the spokesman? Who is bringing, the messenger is also important, right? So when we talk about media literacy and we talk about fact-checking, there are fact-check sites everywhere, things like Snopes. AFP has a fact-check service, and they have a website where you can go and check out anything that's gone viral recently. A lot of news media are starting to fact-check Donald Trump as he speaks, while he's speaking, and there'll be a ticker going down. Not true, this is actually the case. It's happening in British politics as well. We don't have one specifically for Malaysian politicians. We could use one, but the point here is, again, are people going to pay attention to the fact-checking or the fact-checker? I don't have an answer to that. How do you make fact-checking sexy, right? You listen to Donald Trump because he's a hoot. I mean, I don't like him, but it's amazing to see him talk, right? And even though you might think, yeah, probably 50% of his facts are wrong, but he gives you that narrative, and that's the perception that you go away with, right? That, the liberal New York elite is running the country, and I'm here to change that and make America great again. So, I don't have an answer, but I think that's really a solution. How to make truth sexy again, and that people actually want it.
And psychologists tell us a lot of times they'll say, I don't know what he said, but he made me feel good saying it. And maybe there's a little bit of that too. James? No? Okay, yeah, let's turn it over to the floor now and take questions from the audience members. I think we've laid out enough topics that you should be able to jump on there. Any questions, please, to the panelists?
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Tan Siok Chu. I'm a columnist for The Sun and also chairperson of a plantation company. I just wondered, my question is really, does social media help influence how voters receive a message from the politicians? Or is it just the mode of transmission is faster, more speedy? The reason why I ask this is because I think Shannon mentioned that if Guan Eng makes a statement and Mahathir makes a statement, but how the voters perceive and receive the statement, will it change just because it's delivered over, you get it over social media, or rather than traditional media? And I think I would suspect that because voters have a preconceived perception of politicians, therefore whatever they say tends to either usually tends to reinforce their view, or they'll just perceive it from their own perception. But I think the bigger issue of social media really is that how influential is it in determining voter outcomes? This is because I think it tends, the reach of social media and the internet in particular tends to be overestimated. For example, I have plantations in Germanjay, which is quite near Suramban. Would you believe it? There is no internet access. Okay. Usually, and in Sabah, 3 hours out of Kota Kinabalu, again, no internet access. The problem is that the internet capacity, I was told, is very limited. Therefore, in the daytime, it's impossible to send messages, send documents, because there's not enough capacity. My staff have asked me, can we claim overtime allowance, because we can only send after 1 a.m. It's that bad. And you're just talking 3 hours outside Kota Kinabalu. It's not even in the rural areas. Okay. Similarly, Pahang, Negeri Sembilan, in our estates, very, very poor internet access. Okay. You might be able to make phone calls from your handphone, but trying to read news through through your handphone is virtually impossible. Therefore, the key issue going forward, I think, is in the forthcoming elections, how influential will social media be in determining voter outcomes? Thank you.
There were two items that I picked up on that you were mentioning. The who is delivering a particular message we could go back to Aristotle and the ethos, pathos, logos, and that has been applied to political communication. I know in my own research that I found that during President Bush's time in the States, if he made an announcement on something that was dealing with economics, people didn't take it as closely as if the federal chairman, Greenspan or, of the Treasury would say something. So you have to be aligned with the topic. The other issue I think that you're raising is a really important one, and that is of digital divide and knowledge gap, which is an issue that we're struggling with around the globe. I do tell my students it's still hard for them to believe that there are areas without regular internet access. We are creating that knowledge gap, digital divide, and we need to be bridging that rather than expanding it.
I think that the internet would probably play some role, definitely, especially with the young people. Like what James said, they may not necessarily receive it at that time, but they would go out somewhere and get access, and especially if there's a lot of hype, they are likely to be interested, especially with the next elections. And the fact is that I think the Ministry of Communications is also trying to improve internet access and internet speeds. So I think that it could be influential in terms of determining voter outcome for the young people, possibly some influence, but as to how and when, we can only see it, during the run up of the elections. I think that's my view on that.
I think it become increasingly important. I'm not saying that it is the most important factor. Again, it's hard to say why people voted the way they voted. But clearly social media played some part in that decision making. It's going to have a larger influence as the digital divide hopefully narrows by the time we get to the next election. Do people perceive and receive information differently, whether it's from social media or mainstream media? Yeah, I think they do. One of the big themes of the last election was that everyone in Malaysia, wherever you are, as long as you have internet, could watch Mahathir speak. And let me just put this into context. When I was growing up as a kid, being able to see Mahathir was a big thing. He is the prime minister, he's the most powerful man in the country, and Malaysians idolized him at that point, right? Back in the 80s and 90s when he was in power. The idea that everyone in the country can just tune in at 9 p.m. tonight, Mahathir's going to be speaking somewhere in the country, who cares, right? But on the Bersatu Facebook page, you're going to be able to see his speech. And every night people were tuning in to go and see his speech. He had millions of people watching that one Facebook channel, all the way up to May 8th, May 9th, right? And my sense is that people did receive that information at those, what you call cheramas, right, in Malaysia, better than the reports of what he said the next morning or that night itself on whichever newspaper, news portal, or even on a TV broadcast. Of course, it was not broadcast on TV because the TV stations are not going to broadcast an opposition leader. But there's where things like Facebook Live, and you even have it on all sorts of other social media platforms. Being able to see this, for want of a better, celebrity, really, right in front of you in your hand. I think there's kind of a tangible difference here. Not just the digital thing, but just to be able to do this, and I get to see Mahathir, what he's doing right now. There's a strange impact, and I think that there was something to that?
The answer is yes.
If you're worried, if one of your concerns was that there's not enough bandwidth, right? In fact, I noticed in the last elections that yes, Mahathir's rally was like 1 hour plus long. Yep. But what happens is that his team was very smart. They would take clips of it. They shorten it to like 1 minute, 1.5 minutes, or the most 3 minutes, and these were circulated via WhatsApp. So you had the impact. And in my book, I analysed how the rallies in 2013 had less impact compared to the rallies in 2014 because of Facebook Live. In fact, I know of people who actually did not even attend a single rally, but they saw different rallies every night. So they didn't have to go down on the ground. They could just enjoy the aircon and actually see not just within KL, but within, in different parts of Malaysia. So the impact is there. And I think that the team, whoever that's handling the team for the next elections would be smart enough to be able to use social media in creative ways to get the message across. In fact, I think that my view would be that there could be more Insta politicians in the next elections with the young people, coming in, and they would be able to use Snapchat or TikTok or whatever. It's about hype. It's about gaining hype. It's not necessarily like what you mentioned about Donald Trump. It doesn't matter what he says. It's how he says it. And the fact that he makes mistakes along the way doesn't matter because it shows it's genuine. In fact, I've heard some of my students who said that they've got friends in the US. They said, yeah, it shows that he's just like the one of us. It doesn't matter what he says, it's how he says it, and he says it with such honesty. Right, and he's real, and so therefore that's where he gets his, his popularity from. He's real.
I'm from Sunway, so I just want to share two real experience from my side. One is before the government change, I've been invited. Means actually, a lot of people invited to attend luncheon with Zahid Hamidi. The time like he's still the deputy prime minister. So during the luncheon, there are actually groups of publishers, with media, even religious organization. So you're telling us that don't spread the fake news. Don't talk about 1MDB. Talk about Sarawak report. So later also he tells us like you will do that, we will block your channel, we will block your publishers, whatever. So this is happening like before the election. So recently what happened is after the Tanjung BI, the election, so PH lost. Suddenly I received a WhatsApp, which I don't know who is the contact from. It's telling me that, that Anwar Ibrahim today go and meet up the Agong, but can't get him, so nothing changed to Malaysia. So here is my question. Because there are two scenarios. One is the previous government calling us as media people or publishers, whoever, tell us not to spread any fake news that gonna impact on the election. The second one is getting fake info from the current government or like related to current government. So the question would be, are we going to face the same scenario with the new government? Means they will one day invite you guys, come, let's talk about, don't spread fake news about us. Okay? At the same time, you'll receive some other people sending about Anwar going down, Azmin going up, Mahathir is going to whatever, stuff like that. So just want to know whether this is going to happen again.
The first one being whether this government is going to basically clamp down on media the way the previous government did, by referring to news they don't like as fake, right? Because everyone knows 1MDB is real, right? So I can't tell you what the government is going to do, but I think by and large media practitioners in this country feel that there is less control since the new government took over. You're always going to get pressure. You're going to always get phone calls, but most people are reporting now, and this is our actual editors talking. They say, well, if we were doing this 2 years ago, you'd just be waiting for the sledgehammer to happen and your website gets blocked or your printing permit gets pulled. But we are writing all this stuff and we're still around, So editors are out there actually trying to push the envelope and see how far they can get. So maybe when the change of government happened, you didn't see media being so bold, but you're going to see many editors start trying to push the envelope further and further and seeing where we're testing the government's patience. Basically, that's what we're doing. So that's so far better than the previous government. But I can't tell if in 2023, 2 months before the general election, they're going to roll out the sledgehammers again and polish them up. On this whole idea of getting fake stuff on social media is always going to happen. And I don't know whether you can say that, again, you didn't know the contact who sent you that message. So I don't know if it's from someone in Anwar's camp. It might be someone from outside of Anwar's camp. What are the motivations to do that? To say that Anwar is going to the palace, is that a positive thing? I'm still not sure, right? I mean, it could actually, it sounded negative to me if it were true that he went to the palace and Agong doesn't want to see him. Then how are you going to get sworn in as Prime Minister when the time comes? So I don't think the problem is what the government does with regards to how they control the media. The fake news is always going to be there. And I think, as Pauline was saying, it's about how people, what do you do when you receive it? How do you react? You just take it as the whole truth? Or are you going to spend some time fact-checking? And you're not going to be able to stop fake news. Fake news has been around since the serpent told Adam and Eve, you know, if you eat this fruit, nothing's going to happen.
My name is Un from Shah Alam. I think it was about 2 days ago, the Prime Minister said that the government lost the elections, the by-election in Semenyi, as well as Tanjung Piai, because the party Bernama does not have enough members. I think what he was trying to say was that, you know, the internet, to me, played a big role in the victory of Pakatan Harapan last year. But what has happened since then to Pakatan is that less and less people are believing in what Pakatan now says over the internet. So what Mahathir is trying to do, at this point in time, you still can't replace the boots on the ground in a political campaign. I mean, you go down to the ground and see what the women in UMNO do, UMNO Wanita, and you see what the women in PAS do, Muslimat PAS, in that house-to-house campaign. And you scale that up to the ceramah kelompok, and then you scale that up to the mega ceramas. So a lot of influence of the public now in Tanjung Piai was due to all this. And sad to say, Pakatan did not have those boots on the ground. There were even voting stations in certain parts of Tanjung Piai where Pakatan did not have the pachabas, the polling agents, the counting agents, and the barong agents. And you look at pictures of what happened on the polling day itself. You look at the site where all the blues are at the Pondok Panas, plenty. You look at the site where the reds are on their Pondok Panas, few. So I think up to this point in time, no doubt the internet is important, but you still cannot deny the role of having the grassroots to do all that donkey work. And in a political party where there are plenty of big chiefs, but very few red Indians, I think they're going to suffer in the next general election. So what do you all think? Thank you.
Hello, hi, my name is Aziz. I'm from UiTM. Currently, I'm doing my PhD in Durham University. So my question will be a little bit boring. I'm sorry. I will address my question to Dr. Pauline. From your work on Malaysian politics, on new media age, may I know the implications on popular mass communication theory? Is there any critiques or any contributions from your works to the current communication theory? That's my question.
My name's Armand. We spoke a lot about how politicians influence voters. So my question slightly going to be the other way around. How much does the discourse and debate on social media actually influence politicians? Given that a lot of the discourse we see are actually from people from opposite ends, people in the middle ground hardly actually care enough to actually articulate their views, whether it's about ICERD or anything other issue. So does that have an impact on the traditional politics? And are politicians listening? And if they're listening, are they listening to the extreme views and not the middle ground? Thank you.
Well, the last one first then, and that one we did address, and that is their aides and their assistants are watching them, if they in fact are not. So that's probably the short answer to that one. And you're welcome to add anything to it. And Dr. Pauline, we also have to get to the issue of your extension of any theories in the book in relation to Malaysia. And then our first question had to do with is it a good idea to overly rely on the internet versus having boots on the ground, having the people working for you?
Okay, for the first question, definitely boots on the ground. You need that. You need to have people to do the work. Like you say, too many chiefs and not enough. Boots on the ground. It's you need to pound the pavements, so to speak. But in order to get people to pound the pavements, sometimes you need to influence people. And no doubt, I would agree. Wanita UMNO and the past, they used to be very influential. They could work the ground because they had grassroots context. But if you don't have that, you can always use the internet to find your pachabas. Like, for example, if you look at what Bersih did, you look at what Tindak Malaysia did. I've seen Tindak Malaysia. They started off with small group of people, but they could mobilize the country to get pachabas, to organize trainings, etc. So they got their people through social media. Right? So it's about how you use it to get the ground people. So it's just a tool for you to use if you don't have the grassroots connections. That's how I see the situation. With regards to the mass comm theory, we could have a more discussion further. But I came to my study with the idea that perhaps, this study started with my interest 10 years ago when I saw the Arab Spring, and I thought that, perhaps technology would be the one that would change society, and so I thought that it was technological determinism, and the fact that technology would change and be the driver of political change. But I've come to the realization that it may be the start of it, but it's the people themselves who drive the change. It's how we use technology. So I've not more or less modified my views in the sense that it is more of, we start off with technological determinism, where you have the technology first, but along the way it's modified by the people. So social constructivism, that's from after 3 years of study, that for me, that was my conclusion, that it is the people that actually drive the change, not necessarily technology. It may be the impetus, the start, but it's the people that make the difference. Okay, and the last question for the debate online, it depends. Yes, I agree with one. I think somebody said that about it could be the vocal minority that's driving the change. So, which means that the majority should speak out more, so that they do not let the vocal minority determine. And I think what happened was that I think the ICERD and the Rome Statute, where you had a vocal minority dictating or influencing the debate, and that was the problem. When we keep quiet and we don't challenge the existing views, that's when you have the vocal minority, influencing the discourse.
Yeah, the crazies are always the loudest, right? So this is whether you're on the extreme left or on the extreme right. And because of that, they tend to dominate discourse or discussion. I would actually, you asked the question of whether politicians are listening. By default, they will say they are listening, right? I mean, that's what a politician will tell you. My sense is that sometimes they're listening too hard and failing to actually do the work. Now, if you're in government, your job is to govern, not just go around and modify policy because someone shouted at you. That is not literally, but metaphorically, what is happening with our government today. And also, even with the politicians across the aisle in the opposition as well, if they are also supposed to be leading a policy conversation, whether it's in parliament or outside. But it seems that you get people in various NGOs or whatever, build a sphere of influence, and then they influence politicians with quote-unquote public opinion. And there's a lot to be said about silent majority. And how do you actually know what they're thinking? How, one of the things that became a trope over the whole Bersih thing. Remember a couple of years or 3 years ago, Bersih had one rally, and then 2 weeks later, the red shirts had a counter rally, as it were. And so, largely the optics were that if you look at Bersih, it was all Chinese, and it's Chinese trying to overthrow the government, and that's why the Malays responded. Merdeka Center actually did a survey of what people thought about the two rallies. Now, the takeaway I got from that was Malays were asked whether you support Bersih, and something like only 21% of them did, which kind of feels like it proves the point, right? Malays don't support Bersih. But then they were also asked, do you support a red shirt rally? 22%. So basically, the only takeaway you can get from that is Malays don't like to go and rally. Most Malaysians don't like to shout and make a big fuss. We will vote how we will vote, but I don't need to go and influence 100,000 other people by marching on the streets, right? However, thanks to WhatsApp and social media, you can still influence 100,000 people without going to the streets. So, my sense is that the internet, digital technology helps everyone amplify their voice. It can get very noisy. If I were a politician, I would say I would want to ignore the noise, right? And get into the real crux of the matter. How's the economy doing, right? There's a sense here that among Malaysians, the biggest threat to you is someone from another race or whatever, or ISID or I don't know, the Rome Statute and things like that. The biggest threat to all Malaysians is actually climate change and the Industrial Revolution, because you're all going to lose our jobs if you don't know how to work these machines, right? That's the biggest threat to you. But everyone's talking about race, religion, this, that, or the other. There is just too much noise, if you ask me.
And with that, I think I would like to turn it back to our host.
Thank you very much to the panelists for their engaging discussion. As they remain on stage, can I invite Professor Dawn Boyer, Dean of the School of Arts, to launch Dr. Pauline Leong's publication today. And with that, it is my pleasure to announce the official launch of Malaysian Politics in the New Media Age by Dr. Pauline Leong. Thank you very much. Dr. Pauline Leong, would you like to say a few words?
Thank you very much, everyone, for coming for this book launch. I would especially like to thank my supervisor, Prof. James Chin. If it's not for his nagging over the 1 year plus after I finished my PhD, this book would not have come to fruition. It's been a very interesting experience. Like I said just now, this whole project started with my interest. After coming back from Singapore, I was in Singapore for about 14 years. I came back to Malaysia for personal reasons, family reasons, but it has been an interesting ride. I got front row seats to watching how the country has changed since 2008 and then 2013 and 2018, and it's been a privilege to be observer as being part of the change as well. This book is actually a culmination of my interest, in the whole in what happened to Malaysia and the interest in politics. My master's thesis was actually on romancing Singapore, about romance. So politics was never part of the equation of this, but this is how research evolves, from an interest into something that has come into fruition, something that's hard copy. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Pauline. And ladies and gentlemen, that's it for today. We've reached the end of our proceedings. Thank you very much. Please join us for refreshments outside. Thank you.